identity as your agent discovered. They are looking for me. They want me dead. I think they have sent something to find me. I can feel it stalking me, slipping from shadow to shadow, hunting for my hiding place. I keep switching locations to find new rooms to hide in, but it has my scent. Please, Master, I need your help. I need it now. It's getting closer. It wants to silence me.
Narratively, Darktide has been pretty underwhelming up to this point. The story of the main campaign, if you can even call it that, had some hilariously pointless cutscenes and a comically bad finale. Guess what, guys? You are not the traitor! Spoiler alert! We've seen precious little of that Dan Abnett magic. We don't really have any idea where this tale is going, other than maybe a climactic clash with the heads of the Cult of Admonition and the Nurgle boys down below. And yet, there's still plenty of good world building here. Snippets we can glean from chatter on the Vox, soldiers in the Morningstar, and conversations between the characters in-game. Case in point, the increasingly desperate pleas from our girl Wormwood, a throne agent sent to infiltrate the Hive before the arrival of Imperium forces, now being hunted by forces unseen. These Vox transmissions have been awesome. They're incredibly atmospheric and creepy, well acted, and indicative of a much larger war being waged in the system, a war of information, of intrigue and espionage, and a conspiracy of silence. Now that Darktide's in a much better state than it was on launch, and the console version's been out for a few weeks now, we can start looking towards the future, and that future looks very bleak for the residents of Atoma Prime. Something is cooking deep in the bowels of the Mobian domain, and while Nurgle and the Cult of Admonition will continue to be the main antagonists for a while longer yet, there is a larger conspiracy at play here. In and of themselves, these Vox transmissions from Wormwood don't necessarily mean anything important, but when you start diving a little bit deeper and connecting the dots from all over the other sources of chatter and lore snippets we picked up on, a picture begins to coalesce and form. And while Chaos is about as dark and horrifying as it gets from a human perspective in 40k, there are other forces in the galaxy that don't just corrupt planets, they consume them, bringing nightmares on a galactic scale, a shadow in the warp. And that's what we're going to discuss today, because I am fairly confident that Genestealer Cults are in the plans for Darktide's future, and that they will play an important part in the narrative moving forward. First, I'm going to talk about the evidence that supports their inclusion, then we're going to talk about what exactly they are, how they would fit into the gameplay loop of Darktide, and what they would bring to the table in terms of units and a overall roster. So right off the bat, it's important for me to note that the game's very title, Darktide, does not just refer to Chaos. They haven't exactly been forthcoming with the lore. You kind of have to dig around to find anything on the topic, but in blogs and snippets written before launch, it was made clear that Mobian regiments like the 6th have been fighting in a wild stretch of space known as the Fringe for centuries now, against a multitude of chaotic and Xenos threats. Xenos meaning alien. We don't know the true nature of the Xenos threat yet, whether they're allied to Chaos or each other, or what their true aims are, but we do know that for hundreds of years the Mobian domain has been under assault, that entire generations of guardsmen have been scarred or utterly wiped out in the conflict, and that a web of secrecy has been constructed to conceal the true nature of this threat, the true nature of this Darktide. And that even with all this propaganda running rampant, with tales of heroism and valor spun off from the front lines, that some seriously infectious PTSD set in for the Mobian 6th, that they were seduced by the Chaos God Nurgle, and now seek vengeance in a way to spread their new truth across the sector and beyond. We also know that while Tertium Hive has been the main battleground of Darktide thus far, it is not the only Hive city on the planet, and that is a very important point to make. In fact, the playable Psyker characters make mention of sensing the fear and desperation of those souls stuck in this sister city, and every time it comes up in conversation, details are quickly shut down by our handlers. They don't want us to know what's going on there. There's been sightings of Xenos, either in Tertium or its sister hives, perhaps both, and Auric-level operatives have been sent to investigate. And even the terminology and symbols of areas like the Ragged King's Court seem to draw heavy inspiration from Xenos mythology. Purple banners, bald-headed warriors who don't appear entirely human, cults in the bowels of a hive, and strange markings unrelated to Chaos sprinkled throughout certain maps. But probably the biggest bombshell that dropped recently, that was really the impetus for this video and why I wanted to discuss Genestealer Cults in depth, is the news from Patriarch that they have created new tech that lets multiple factions fight each other simultaneously. And I quote from the Necromancer blog post for Vermintide, "So, having done the groundwork, we now have a bit of tech in place for enemies fighting enemies. We're pretty excited toying around with what that could afford for the future." Essentially, the skeletons of Sienna's new class function as their own entities that can interact with the enemy units, fight them, kill them, die to them, and this is functionality that did not exist previously in the Tide series. What it means for Darktide is the potential for familiars like servitors on an admech class, and multiple enemy factions that can engage each other as well as the player. So you could stumble into a cavern where Nurgle and Tyranids are already murdering each other. Sounds like quite a bit of fun. Now, I'd previously been under the assumption that if Tyranids or Orcs or some other Xenos faction were to come to Darktide, that they would simply have their own levels or areas of levels cut off from the forces of chaos in the way that Into the Nest is a Skaven only map or Dark Omens is only Beastmen, which would have worked out just fine, I think. But as we've seen, assets and ideas tend to be developed in parallel with each other between Vermintide and Darktide, so it can be transferred to one another or vice versa. Things like the Brain Burst, career abilities, and tracking staff attacks, not to mention the core elements and features of combat that both games share. On the lore and world building side, we know that Sergeant Major Morrow has expertise in a wide variety of wars, most notably in the Third War for Armageddon, where he was subsequently stuck for hundreds of years in warp transit, which probably only felt to him like a moment. But he also led a fierce campaign against Tyranid Genestealers in the Xanatros Purgation, mentioned in several quotes from player characters, and he may have very well been the only human to walk out of that situation alive. Then there's the Vox transmissions themselves, which have steadily seemed to shift away from Nurgle imagery, and perhaps been implying that another hidden force is afoot. When you listen to Wormwood's last message, it no longer evokes the plotting, grinding, inexorable nature of the Plague Father and his demons, but rather that of a stealthy, sinister monster, tracking her in dark passageways and looking to silence her. This is certainly something Traitor Guardsmen could organize themselves. It could just be fluff and not really mean anything outside of chaos. Chaos is sinister, chaos is scary, I get it. They've entered into a pact with Chaos and could very likely summon demonic entities that don't just reflect Nurgle, or indeed just employ their own hounds or snipers to finish the job. But that description much more closely resembles the behavior of a Lictor, a Genestealer Sanctus Assassin, or perhaps even a Purestrain that's been given her sense. Nurgle typically isn't associated with stealth or assassination or silencing of opposition, although, of course, they do murder people just like everything else Chaos. On the gameplay side, we've seen that Patriarch likes to create multiple enemy factions in their games to diversify the threats a player can face, Rotblood, Skaven, Beastmen being the prime example from Vermintide, that Tertium sister cities fall silent to some unknown threat, and that Hive cities are the perfect setting for Genestealers, who are maybe the ideal enemy faction in a 40k horde shooter. We'll talk about why at length in a moment. But yeah, it's a gorgeous fit on the gameplay side and from a lore perspective. Feels like the evidence is beginning to coalesce to form this coherent and logical picture, a future complete with purple abominations as heralds for an even greater threat to come. So, what the hell are Genestealers, and why would they fit so perfectly in Darktide? What would the archetypes and enemies be? What would they look like, and how would they play? How do they fit into this bigger picture of a world on the brink of destruction and now under threat from multiple sources? Allegedly. Well, Genestealer Cults are the cancer of the Imperium's underbelly. A malignant Xenos infection that, just like the Skaven, grows in the sewers and cellars of a hive until it bubbles forth in an uprising that can completely consume the surface world. Their purpose is simple. They act as the harbinger of a true Tyranid invasion, though it may take centuries or millennia for a hive fleet to arrive, by injecting genetic material into a host. In so doing, they create an unwilling and unknowing slave whose sole desire it is to propagate a hybrid species through mating. Given enough time, this infestation can lead to generations of brainwashed sons and daughters, all under the psychic influence of a Patriarch and his magi, who may not even know or understand what Tyranids are, but nonetheless spread the sermons and influence of their cult through persuasion and procreation, teaching the faith of this great cosmic deity. They corrupt all they come in contact with until at last their psychic gestalt and numbers grow so powerful, their presence attracts the Tyranid hive fleet, who descends upon the world to consume everyone and everything on it, cult included. From the depths, they rise to claim the city, then the planet, welcoming the absorption of their biomass into the cataclysmic invasion force now arriving from the stars. It only takes a single Purestrain Genestealer, hidden away on the decks of a ship, in the bowels of a whale carcass, or stowed away in a cargo hold, to stumble upon a new world teeming with billions or trillions of life forms, and through secrecy, patience, and a biological need to serve the Tyranid broodmind, that single organism can bring a planet to its knees. Over the course of 4 generations, the offspring of the cult will transform from hellish xenomorph monstrosities into passable humans who may take positions of power in the local government to pass tithes and laws that favor its spread. The base form of a Genestealer cult is the Purestrain. This is the Hive Fleet's vanguard organism, responsible for initial infection of a planet, and certainly one of the most terrifying creatures in the entire universe of 40k. They are fast, incredibly deadly, can rend apart Terminator armor with their claws, and swarm in the thousands, or stalk as a solo predator cut off from support and without any help from the rest of the Hive Fleet. In Space Hulk Deathwing, they were the game's main horde enemy, but we were playing as Dark Angel Terminators then, so sending hundreds or thousands our way would probably be a little bit above our pay grade. My educated guess is that with a single Hive city beginning to fall to a Genestealer uprising, if indeed that is the case, the cycle on Atoma Prime hasn't yet come around to birthing Purestrains in that 5th generation. So there would likely be some in patrols or packs, but certainly not in those massive numbers we see on the Space Hulk in Space Hulk Deathwing, and certainly not in the same numbers as Poxwalkers or Groaners in Darktide. They'd be fairly simple to take down with combined arms fire. Certainly plasma, las guns, all that have the power to bring them down, but very high damage and extremely dangerous when mixed in with the rest of the cult. Genestealers in general are typically considered glass cannons. They hit really hard, but they can be killed. Before we go any further on the unit selections here, again we come back to that power level discussion which everyone and their mother and brother seems to have a different opinion on, and that leads into my main point. There is no hard and fast power level for anything in this setting, with the possible exception of Primarchs and the Emperor, Phoenix Lords, maybe a few other things. In Darktide, we routinely go into overrun habs to fight demon hosts, beasts of Nurgle, thousands of plague zombies, and hundreds of armored heretics with heavy weapons and substantial training. These are the kinds of missions Space Marines would typically get sent to in the lore. While we are clearly not as powerful, well-equipped, or well-trained as Astartes, we really don't need to be limiting ourselves too much based on lore power, because there is very little, if any, consistency across various 40k novels and mediums. If you can fight demon hosts, and beasts of Nurgle, and armies of heretics in a 4-man squad cut off from any help whatsoever, you can fight Chaos Space Marines, you can fight sorcerers, you can fight a big chunk of their roster and come out alive, especially when you're armed with plasma guns and power swords and bolters and the magical might of a psyker. This is a video game. Our level 30 characters are very powerful now. There is little need to restrict enemy variety drastically here because we're capable of handling a lot of what a Genestealer cult could throw at us. With that in mind, the mainline fodder would just be poor infected hive scum armed with pipes and crude weaponry comprised of the very first generations of Xenos. Acolyte hybrids would form the more primitive mainline infantry, wielding las pistols, auto pistols, the occasional power tool, drill dozer blades, and bone swords, while the neophyte 3rd and 4th generations would appear much more human, probably only have 2 or only 3 appendages, using auto guns, shotguns, heavy mining tools, and the occasional rocket launcher. Acolyte hybrids are a lot more primal, a lot more similar to the original Genestealer that infected them initially. The 4th and 3rd generations of the neophytes would be a lot more human looking, but their behavior would be extremely similar to the enemy types already in Darktide, and in some cases wouldn't need much in the way of new animations at all. I mean, acolytes from the 1st generation would still be super purple and weird looking with 6 arms, they would move differently and have unique attack patterns, but the neophyte infantry would be much like the dregs that are already in game, and frankly, I don't know that they would need anything new in terms of animations at all. And so we already have the baseline of a new faction here, 3 or 4 units in, using guns and crude melee tools without an absurd amount of work. But of course, the real fun comes with the specials, elites, and bosses, and that's where stuff gets really interesting. Aberrants and Abominants would be the heavy muscle of a Genestealer cult, serving as maulers and crushers, that kind of unit archetype. They're hulking abominations with massive digging tools, used to spread the tunnels under a hive, but double as shock assault troops when the insurgency rises to the surface. The Sanctus is an assassin equivalent, equipped with atrophy blades enhanced with psychic power, and utilizing sniper rifle needle guns from range. I'd see that performing a role between a gutter runner and a sniper, but not being as quick or aggressive in either role, but performing more like a hybrid in between the two. The toxic darts they fire would disable you and deal slight damage over time, and if you got close to it, it would pounce like an assassin, and after a long animation, if it managed to sink its psychoactive blades into you, it would be an instant down. If it did it to a psyker, it would literally cause you to explode. But the pounce and stab would both be more reactable than what you'd see from an assassin, and leave time for teammates to knock them off before the deed is done. So the animation and down would not be instant if it pounced you. There would be a little bit of time for a teammate to shoot them off or kill it before it happens. The Biophagus is a mad scientist and gene manipulator, using bioalchemy to support aberrants and hurling toxic chemical vials from across the room. When alone, it would play much like a bomber, covering the ground in corrosive acid and denying that area, but they could also march to war in a phalanx of power hammer wielding aberrants, and from that position, they'd be a support specialist, buffing the monsters and its entourage with stimulants from his injector goad. Genomic enhancement makes them stronger, tougher, and faster, and it'd be a buff that could affect one monster at a time while he's alive, so there'd be this Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory in the middle of a storm vermin patrol of heavy shock infantry, lobbing the occasional chem weapon, and making aberrants much more dangerous. The Kelermorph is a triple-armed gunslinger seen as a heroic figure of revolution within a cult, dealing high burst damage at close range. Just a tornado of CQB blasting, would be very quick, hard to pin down, but easy to kill once you manage to catch one. For the people who know 40k, I think Kelermorph is probably the most anticipated type of hero specialist we could get in a Genestealer Cult roster. They look incredibly cool and have some really cool weaponry as well. The Clamovis is a propagandist, unleashing static from its scrambler array in a nullifying, distorting resonance, essentially amplifying the shadow and the warp that Tyranids are known for, to disrupt coherency toughness regen while it's alive. Using its loudspeaker proclamator Hailer, you'd hear it saying spooky things over the Vox as it speeds up all cultists in the vicinity and buffs everything nearby. So it wouldn't really be a combat specialist in any way, shape, or form. It would just be about buffing its allies and debuffing you and your allies when you're in coherency together. And in a similar manner, the Acolyte Icon Ward is literally just a Wargore standard bear. If you read its description, it's quite literally the exact same thing that a Wargore does currently in Vermintide 2. That could be translated one-to-one. The Primus and Magus are Trader Captain, Chaos Lord, and Chaos Sorcerer or Psyker equivalents. But the big question are bosses, sub-bosses, and how those would tie into a narrative or campaign structure. Every Genestealer cult has a Patriarch, a heavily mutated Purestrain that was typically the first to set foot on a planet and the first to infect a living host. There is only one Patriarch who's the father of the dynasty, and he grows real big and real scary. They're huge, powerful psychic creatures that control the Broodmind, which is the psychic gestalt that keeps the entire cult organized and together, working in singular purpose. They are double the size of a Terminator, can cut one in half with a single blow from their massive claws, and control the minds of lesser beings through warpish willpower. One of the scariest creatures we could possibly face in the entire universe, but a logical endgame boss nonetheless. Again, I don't want to hear that we can't fight or kill one. The lore says a Patriarch can poop his pants and the world will immediately implode and everyone will die. It's so powerful, it's so strong, it's what the army book said. There's no way anyone could ever kill it. No, every lore snippet for every faction says stuff like that. Again, this is a video game. We have all the equipment and power necessary to take one down. It should just be really dangerous and really hard, as any endgame boss should be. Realistically, if we're being sent in to deal with a Genestealer cult, getting rid of the Patriarch is a really important element of that. And if you want to conclude the fight with a Valkyrie strike or a Lehman Rush shot from a huge las cannon mounted on the prow, what have you, by all means. Again, we're fighting multiple demon hosts a run, and though they vary in power, so can Patriarchs. The leader of a cult that's taken a whole world from a population of trillions is almost certainly more powerful than one who partially controls a single hive city of a few billion. So the Patriarch we fight could be on the lower end of the spectrum. That would be a good explanation, but either way, Patriarchs are scary, but they're something we can kill. So the finale of this expansion would be finding that Patriarch and killing it, trying to end the cult threat forever and purge the plague from Atoma Prime. But of course, if even one Genestealer escapes our clutches, then the cycle will likely begin anew again. The way I would personally handle this is to have the Scythestrain or a Broodlord equivalent be a sub-boss in that slot where Beasts of Nurgle, Demon Hosts, Rat Ogres, Stormfiends are, and then the legit real Patriarch would be the finale. Now, Broodlords are technically super similar, or the exact same as a Patriarch, except they're spawned from a hive fleet rather than manifesting after the creation of a cult. So in reality, they're equivalent, and there may only technically be one of them, but the reality is we've already had a game where you kill multiple Broodlords during the course of a campaign in Space Hulk Deathwing. I think you kill 3 or 4 during just your first play session on that game. So whether they wanted to make the sub-boss be a Broodlord, or the very similar and extremely dangerous Scythestrain that you also see in Space Hulk, or something roughly equivalent, it's entirely up to them, but we definitely need a huge hulking Tyranid monstrosity as a sub-boss, and Broodlords fit that just about perfectly. Just give the Patriarch access to more range attacks and psychic powers, make him more dangerous while still retaining those horrific scything talons, while the Broodlord focuses almost purely on melee with maybe the occasional dodgeable psychic blast. In terms of playstyle, or how the cults approach combat, they would be more ambush focused than the Traitor Guard we currently have in Darktide. Packs of 8 to 12 Purestrain Genestealers might jump from behind a corner or a little dark cavern and quickly try to rip a player to shreds. Reductus Saboteurs could lay explosive traps that down a bumbling, unwary ally should they stumble into it. The mainline infantry and trash mobs would perform and act very similarly to the stuff we already know from the Mobian 6th, but as a whole they'd have a heavier emphasis on melee and sneak attacks, and they'd also incorporate mining tools in their attacks. You turn a corner, and there's a horde of hybrids and neophytes with mining weapons trying to cut you to pieces and a locust pouncing on your ally. To tie it all back into the new Tide tech for enemies, Genestealer cults fight chaos all the time. They are obsessed and single-minded in their will to keep their people safe and to see the hive fleets descend upon their world. So they will fight chaos just as readily as we do in preparation for Armageddon. They do not work together in any capacity. Chaos and Tyranids do not like each other. Tyranids consume anything and everything in their path, Xenos, human, and Chaos alike. And if the biomass of a planet is consumed, well then Chaos can't corrupt it, can they? So yeah, they are not in any way, shape, or form friends or allies. As for what I'm personally hyped for, a Biophagus with an Aberrant patrol is maybe the thing I want to see most besides a Broodlord. I think that just sounds freaking awesome and fits that Stormvermin patrol archetype so well. But there are a lot of things that could be translated almost one-to-one with the Genestealer cults to Darktide. And of course, I don't think if they make a Genestealer cult faction, they just copy everything over and try to put it into these archetypes that already exist. There needs to be new stuff, new ways to approach combat, new specialists that do their own thing. But some of that can be copied over fairly easily, and I think that makes them a much more attractive addition to the game. So many of their heroes and units fit perfectly in the Hive City setting, and established lore seems to be leaning heavily in their direction. I do think they're coming. There are almost certainly content drops that will happen first, but just like Beastmen for Vermintide 2, I expect we will see Genestealer cults manifest on Atoma Prime sooner rather than later. I just hope their arrival goes a little bit smoother and the roster is more fleshed out than the Cloven ones in Winds of Magic. But let me know what you guys think, what units and specials and elites, mechanics, or weaponry you'd like to see. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Any Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.